Meanwhile, Colonel Leroy E. Nelson, who had commanded the Illinois National Guard's 132nd Infantry Regiment since 1937, was reported to be ill, and on the 28th of December was replaced by 41-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Alexander M. George. Colonel George was a regular army officer, considered to be somewhat eccentric by the men of the 132nd. It was not a good exchange, but Patch was working the old buddy network. He eventually would replace all former National Guard officers with West Pointers. Colonel Nelson's departure had left a deep cavity that George never filled. The GIs of the 2nd Battalion, 132nd Infantry, received a pep talk from the colonel, stressing the importance of their mission and stating that they had to accomplish it regardless of the price. Small talk inasmuch as the colonel remained safe back in the command post. On the 30th of December, Field Order No. 1 from the 132nd Infantry Headquarters also spelled out what was expected of the GIs. Paragraph 3X of the order reads, "Upon capture of Hill 27, a perimeter defence will be established and will be defended at all costs." At noon on the 31st of December, the 2nd Battalion, 132nd Infantry, arrived at the Mount Austin bivouac area. They would remain there until the following morning, when they would continue the drive. The enemy positions adjacent to Hill 27 were constantly being bombarded, and some of the shells fell short, exploding on the men of two 132nds. To secure themselves, they dug deep slit trenches and then bedded down for the night, knowing that the next day they would jump off for the assault on the hill. On the 1st of January at Rabaul, New Britain Island, the Yano Butai, 230th Infantry Replacement Unit, celebrated the start of the new year at the Tanura district. The Yano soldiers had recently arrived from Shizuoka, Japan, where they had been part of the 34th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Division. The US 14th Corps troops later would meet part of the Yano Butai, which had been sent to cover the Japanese withdrawal along the coast route to Cape Esperance. On the 2nd of January, at the Gifu Fortress, Major Megumi Ishido took over the command of the 1st Battalion, 124th Infantry, when Major Yukichi Kokusho was killed. The diary of PFC Haraguchi Mizuguchi of the 5th Company, 230th Regiment, reflects on the new year and the ending of the previous 12 war-torn months. 1942 finally comes to an end today. Looking back over this year, truly, it has been eventful and fraught with difficulties. It is more than a year since the beginning of the Greater East Asian War. I was called up to the colours again and have been in 10 months, during which time I participated in the occupation battle of Guadalcanal Island in the Solomon Islands Group in October. At present, I am enduring hardships and privations in the middle of a hard battle. It is a great decisive Japanese-American war, which will never be forgotten. In the homeland, it is the end of the year and a very busy period, but we, without enough food, end this year on 5 shaku of gruel that has been our daily ration continuously for 15 days. Truly, my body has become weakened. Tonight I greeted the new year by eating 5 shaku of gruel, imagining it to be lucky noodles of the homeland. Today I defecated for the first time since the 22nd and felt greatly relieved. At 0600 on New Year's Day, the American Division's 2nd Battalion, 132nd Infantry, had been slowly working its way up the nearly vertical slopes of Hill 27, while the supporting artillery pounded the Japanese positions for 25 minutes. Companies E and F were the main attacking force, with Company G in regimental reserve. Throughout the approach to the hill, the men had encountered heavy sniper fire, which took its toll. As the American guns opened up, a number of the Japanese had slipped away and retreated to the nearby jungle at the base of the knoll. When 2 platoons from Companies E and F finally advanced to the hilltop, they met fierce automatic fire from the right flank. First Lieutenant Tasuji Tamai of the 8th Company, 230th Infantry, had taken 2 platoons to the position formerly held by Lieutenant Wakabayashi on the outskirts of the Gifu stronghold. Tamai was ordered to protect his position, while 2nd Lieutenant Suichi Sawano's 3rd Platoon moved to the edge of the jungle to contain the Americans. That night, 3 bold submarines crept into Cape Esperance Bay. I-168, Lieutenant Sidia Sake Nakajima, I-169, Lieutenant Sidia Katsuji Watanabe, and I-171, Sida Takaro Kawasaki. The Daihatsu dashed out from shore to unload the welcome cargo, but after only some 15 tons of food provisions had been dispersed, the 400-ton submarines were chased away by 2 Tulagi-based PT boats. By February 1943, the Japanese submarines had made 28 runs from Rabaul and Bougainville, delivering 1,500 tons of supplies, but it was minor compared to what actually was required. That afternoon of New Year's Day at Mount Austin, between 1200 and 1630, some 6 hours after the American artillery had been pounding Japanese troops at Hill 27, the 1st Company of the Japanese 10th Independent Mountain Artillery Regiment sent a barrage of 30 rounds of 75mm shells back in their direction. Post-war Japanese records reveal that, in contrast, the Americans had sent 782 artillery rounds at the Gifu stand. Astonished that the Americans had so much firepower, the Japanese assigned an officer to count the incoming shells. That day, 1st Lieutenant Okajima of the 230th Infantry wrote in his diary, "It is really terrible to see electricity go on at the enemy airfield. In January, assorted Japanese units were occupying the hills in front of the Americans. One unit, identified as the 1st Battalion, 229th Infantry, had only 170 men. Captain Kiyoshi Saito's 3rd Company, 38th Engineer Regiment, also had been dispatched to Mount Austin as reinforcements to strengthen the battered 124th Infantry, but the backup was only a few dozen men. On the 5th of January, 50 additional men from the 2nd Company, 230th Infantry under 1st Lieutenant Mano Tomotsu, arrived to support the stronghold, another group of piecemeal reinforcements. Nevertheless, the Japanese were determined to retain the area as long as possible. An additional force, elements of the 3rd Battalion, 230th Infantry, commanded by Major Ampe Onada, was stationed between Hills 43, part of Seahorse Ridge, and 53, part of Galloping Horse Ridge, while regimental headquarters plus the 1st Battalion were at Hills 75, 78, and 80 of Skyline Ridge, Sakai Dai. On Hill 903, US Hill 89, was Captain Kyotaro Oishi's 3rd Company, 10th Independent Mountain Artillery Regiment, but Oishi's company had only 2 75mm model 41 mountain guns and was short of ammunition. The men had left 2 of their weapons on the beach. Pursuit Kozichihi Kaneko states that the 10th had observation platforms in the trees, only manned during daylight hours. The 2 squads of 2nd Lieutenant Kazumi Yokoyama's 1st Platoon, 228th Infantry Howitzer Company, and 2nd Lieutenant Suhei Itani's 3rd and 4th Squads, 2nd Platoon, 228th Infantry Howitzer Company, had their Type 41 mountain guns, weapons that would duel with those of the Americans, but they also were short of ammunition. In the same sector was the 2nd Company, 228th Infantry Machine Gun Unit, which would inflict havoc on the advancing U.S. Army's 132nd Infantry Regiment, LCPL. Haicho Shoichi Matsushima of the 38th Engineer Regiment stated in his POW interrogation report, "There was a ration dump and small anti-aircraft trenches, but no gun emplacements, at Hill 903, and from here to the Maruyama Road, the POW's unit established a path for the transportation of supplies and litters." The riflemen of Company F were forced to forsake their holes and left the LMGs to their fate. Automatic weapons aren't worth 2 cents without rifle support, and fortunately GIs from Company G were placed on the right flank to reinforce the gun's support. Luckily, we reached there in time. Private William C. Gately was KIA, and Private Voitke was wounded. The enemy made it so hot up here we were forced to retreat about 50 yards, and in the confusion 2 LMG were left behind. Pursuit James M. MacDonald went ahead and recaptured one of the weapons. When we attacked, we had losses. The enemy snipers accounted for many of our casualties when the other battalions failed to coordinate the strike with us. I saw men get shot in the back, head and legs, and still move under their own power, and all night the enemy artillery shells dropped between us. That night we dug foxholes deep, real deep. Company K was having its own troubles assaulting Hill 31. Hugging the jungle floor was a pillbox, dubbed the Gooseberry, because the men could neither knock it out nor contain it, with fire ports covering all directions and supported by area sector fortifications. It was the most impregnable pillbox in the complex. In his diary entry of the 3rd of January, Micek frankly admitted, "I was never so glad to see the daylight. Our line held through the night, and we were prepared to continue the attack. We did, and P-Sit George J. Riley, Company G, was killed when he walked into an enemy-prepared fire lane, while Private Hoelzel received 2 bullets in his leg, and Pete Zweifler suffered from shell shock. Now the 1st Battalion is going to attack tomorrow. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army 20th Station Hospital, a well-equipped medical unit, had landed at the docks on the 4th of January at Kukum and moved to the Levers Plantation area along the left bank of the Tanaru River, just in time to provide medical support for the push west. The 121st Medical Battalion, a component of the Americal Division, was in the grove adjacent to the hospital, which soon was packed with many serious cases of malaria. A large number of the hospital beds also were filled by the wounded, and the morgue, set in a building to the rear, was almost at capacity. The 132nd Infantry Regiment, having gained no traction, dug in for safety while rimming the Gifu post on the north, east and south, and there the enemy would demonstrate his terrible determination. American soldiers continued to push at the Gifu strongpoint in order to besiege Mount Austin, and the 132nd took a large number of casualties without making appreciable progress. On the 6th of January, a fresh set of faces would be seen on the Rock when the 6th Marines arrived from Longbow, Wellington, New Zealand. These ex-Iceland Leathernecks were getting their first sight of a jungle. Accompanying the 6th Regiment was the 2nd Battalion, 10th Marines, Companies C and F, 18th Marines, and the 2nd Platoon, Battery A, 2nd Special Weapons Company. The 7th and 11th Marines, the rear echelon of the 1st Marine Division, boarded the transports that had delivered the 6th Marines. They were headed to Australia as part of TF 62 and 62.6, and were joined by 947 men of the 6th Seabees, plus 147 sailors from CUB-1. Lieutenant George W. Polk, USNR, one of the CUB-1 officers, ended up with a 6-month stay at the 118th General Hospital in Sydney, Australia, as a result of fatigue and stress. The 14th Corps figured the Japanese were escaping west via Beaufort Bay on Guadalcanal's southwest coast. To prevent that movement, they assigned a force built around Company 1, 147th Infantry, led by Captain Charles E. Beach, one platoon from Company M, led by First Lieutenant Harold L. Dubick, one platoon from the Anti-Tank Company, and engineer, medical and communication troops. The force boarded 2 LCTs on the 7th of January at Kukum to sail at night around the Japanese base at Cape Esperance on the island's northwest tip. They reached the Catholic mission at Beaufort Bay 2 days later. Captain Beach's troops were tasked with guarding the trails to prevent any enemy movement southward from Kokumbona to the mountains on the south coast. At this time, the 11th Naval Construction Battalion arrived on the 8th of January, increasing the Seabees on the island to more than 5,000 men. They were to help modernize the Guadalcanal base, extending roads, building bridges, setting up telephone lines, working on airstrips, and performing various tasks. Additionally, a force known as the CAM, Composite Army Marine Division, was temporarily activated under the U.S. Army's 16th Corps, with the intention of consolidating the Far West offensive to drive the Japanese off the island. The CAM division comprised the 147th Infantry Regiment, minus 1 battalion and 1 company, the 182nd Infantry Regiment, minus 1 battalion, the 2nd Marines, minus the 3rd Battalion, the 6th Marines, the 8th Marines, and the 10th Marines. The staff was that of the 2nd Marine Division. Also on the 8th of January, the Poitiers Corps distributed documents urging the Japanese to surrender, with only 2 soldiers responding. The Corps then broadcast a concession message, but no one in the enemy camp accepted the offer. The following day, the Cactus Air Force dropped 18,000 surrender leaflets on the Gifu sector, but still no one surrendered. On the 9th of January, a formation of 170 GIs from the 147th Infantry Regiment landed at Tangarare on the southwest coast of Guadalcanal and moved northward to the remote village of Vurai, southwest of Kokumbona, with 125 native carriers. Their mission was to scout the area for the presence of the enemy. 4 days later, while deep in the hinterland, the detachment faced labour issues when the carriers went on strike for higher wages. The cannibal battalion sought pre-war wages, which were beyond the means of the common infantryman. However, with a few dollars contributed by the men of the 147th, the issue was resolved and their mission continued. On the same day, the 132nd Infantry Regiment was instructed to police their area, picking up discarded food cans, rifle clips, and empty cartridge cases. This sector was to be taken over by the U.S. Army's 25th Infantry Division, known as the Pineapple Soldiers, by the GIs of the 132nd. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commander of the 25th Division, was given the sarcastic nickname of Clean-Up Collins. By the 10th of January, the 132nd had lost 122 men KIA and 258 WIA, with 4 missing. The regiment had fought hard for control of the Gifu sector for 26 days and endured heavy casualties. On the 14th, the 6th and 8th Marines took over Hills 66 and 76 from the 2nd Marines, and late in the day began extensive patrolling. On the 15th, a patrol from the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, located 9 well-concealed log-placed pillboxes south of Hill 76 in a narrow, wooded, steep ravine. The Marines knocked out 2 of the boxes, but were forced to withdraw due to deadly fire. The following day, the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, entered a hill sector they named the Cat's Ears. On the 17th, they captured a flamethrower, their first, and tested it on 3 occupied pillboxes with devastating effect. Late that afternoon, the 1st Battalion, 182nd Infantry Regiment, moved in line and prepared to hit positions in a draw between Hills 77 and 80, adjacent to the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, near Hill 76 and Company G, 6th Marines. The Pineapple Soldiers, replacing the battered 132nd Infantry Regiment in the Mount Austin sector, had been defending the Hawaiian Islands against a possible invasion. When that threat dissipated, plans were made to transfer the 25th Division to the Southwest Pacific area for duty in New Guinea. On the 20th of October, the division received an alert order to move out, and on the 2nd of November it was slated for the Southwest Pacific. With the situation on Guadalcanal still critical, new orders were issued reassigning the 25th Division there. The plan was to go to New Caledonia in 3 stages, at 10-day intervals, and then transfer to Guadalcanal. The first to leave was the 35th Regimental Combat Team, which boarded the transports on the 25th of November and reached Guadalcanal on the 18th of December. Next was the 161st Infantry, which arrived on the 4th of January. The rear echelon, the 27th Infantry Regiment, arrived 3 days later. Shortly after, the 25th Division troops moved into a staging area near Lunga Point and were assigned to relieve the 132nd Infantry at Mount Austin, with orders to capture the strategically important Hill 27. On the 5th of January, to soften up the sector and aid the GIs in capturing the territory, SBD Dauntless aircraft of VMSB 131 began bombing the hills and valleys adjacent to Hill 27. However, the Japanese were well dug in, and it would take more than occasional bombing strikes to impact the fortresses around the hill. To support the 25th Infantry Division's drive, artillery shelled the ravines and laid a smoke line from the southwest tip of Hill 55 to the left of Galloping Horse Ridge. The smoke line was intended to protect friendly troops, and no aircraft were to bomb east of it. However, events did not proceed as planned. A short round exploded an ammunition dump on Hill 56, and the resulting smoke confused the pilots, leading to a charge dropped on an area occupied by friendly troops. Surprisingly, no one was injured. While the SBDs were dropping bombs, the 25th Infantry Division, with the 161st Infantry held in reserve, began an advance westward to strike an area previously held by the 8th Marines. On the 10th of January, while engaging the Japanese, Company M of the 35th Infantry Regiment was hit by point-blank fire. The advance stalled around Hill 43, where it faced Major Tsuguto Tomoda of I-229I, who had replaced Major Sugura Orita, wounded in action. Units led by Captain Kiyoshi Saito, 38th Engineers, 2nd Lieutenant Ito, 228I, and 1st Lieutenant Murota, 228I, were ordered to repel the attack by striking the Americans on the right flank of the Gifu strongpoint. Major Tomoda informed his company commanders that about 300 Americans had enveloped the rear of the Gifu area. At the same time, Company K of the 3rd Battalion, 35th Infantry Regiment, was crossing a stream en route to the Seahorse sector, Hills 43 and 44. Part of the company was on one bank and part on the other, but the men had neglected to emplace machine guns to protect the crossing. This lapse in infantry fundamentals was a sign of the troops' inexperience, and the Japanese seized the advantage. They attacked in force, threatening and bending the front line. Sergeant William G. Fournier, a machine gun crew chief, stood his ground when his gunner and assistant were killed. Seeing an unattended machine gun, Fournier and T of 5, Lewis Hall ran to it and swung the weapon into action. Both were killed in the firefight, but the Japanese attack was halted, and Fournier and Hall received posthumous medals of honor for their heroic actions. On the 13th of January, the 8th Marines moved forward, supported by the 2nd Marines. Their attack, set to start at dawn, was backed up by 2 platoons of the 2nd Pioneer Battalion, a 75 mm platoon, and Company B of the 2nd Tank Battalion. The 2nd Marine Regiment was on the left wing, and the 8th was on the right. Their task was to neutralize Hill 76 and its adjacent Hill 82 to the immediate north, as well as Hills 83 and 84, adjoining Hill 82 north-northeast. The 2nd Marines reached their objectives, Hills 76 and 82, but lost 6 killed and 61 wounded. The 8th Marines managed to capture Hills 78 and 80, but also took casualties. A concentrated firefight ensued, and by sheer willpower the regiment moved forward. By the 17th, the Marines attacked a strongly fortified bunker just west of Hills 78 and 80. The next day, the 8th Regiment managed to clear the crevice and seize those hills. The 35th Infantry Regiment's orders were to capture the Gifu strongpoint and then swing around to clean up the Seahorse complex, while elements neutralized the summits of Hills 50 to 57 around Galloping Horse Ridge. Hill 52 would be named Sims Hill, in honor of Lieutenant Weldon Sims, who was killed while exploring there. The 64th, 8th, 89th and 90th Field Artillery Battalions would provide fire support for the drive. The 35th 3rd Battalion was to make an encompassing movement around the foot of Mount Austin, while its 2nd Battalion would hit key positions on Hill 27, and its 1st Battalion would be in reserve. The 3rd Battalion of the 35th, led by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver E. Smith, moved forward on the 13th. However, they were met with a formidable resistance. The Japanese defenders, well entrenched in the hill complex, utilized every available resource to stall the advance. Under the leadership of Major Tsuguto Tomoda and Captain Kiyoshi Saito, the Japanese mounted a fierce defense. Despite these challenges, the relentless push by the 35th Infantry Regiment and the supporting units eventually began to yield progress. The battle for Hill 27 and the surrounding areas was intense and costly, but was essential for the Allied forces' strategic objectives. Lieutenant Okajima reported in his diary that the commanding officers of both the 5th Company, 1st Lieutenant Hiyoshi Mitsui, and the 8th Company, 2nd Lieutenant Matsuro Tsurumaru, were killed on the 19th. Major Nishiyama assigned 1st Lieutenant Gen Fujita to replace Tsurumaru. Despite the increase in manpower, the Japanese still had no effective method to stop the Americans' penetration. While the Americans were hitting hard at the Japanese, some of the soldiers, having heard rumors of an evacuation, began to slip away and move down the coast in stages under the cover of darkness. Some stayed, but they would not walk out alive. After days of surrounding the Gifu and taking casualties, someone in the 25th Infantry Division suggested using tanks to knock out the difficult bunkers. 3 light Marine M3A1 tanks of the 2nd Tank Battalion were assigned to reduce the bastion. The GIs hoped the tanks would lessen their casualties. However, en route, 2 of the tanks became bogged down in the mire of Wright Road, while 1 Stuart tank managed to crawl forward. The Stuart, commanded by Captain Theodore Dease and named Mabel, was accompanied by 18 Pineapple soldiers as a covering guard. The tank blasted through the Japanese barriers on the last redoubt. Its 37mm gun knocked out 9 fortifications and destroyed a 200-yard-long strongpoint, allowing a flood of American soldiers to enter the fortress. Back on the 18th, while the army had been slugging it out on Mount Austin, the 6th Marines had moved up the coast. Company K, 3/6, became involved in a firefight with a number of Japanese sailors. The engagement finally broke off about dusk. The next morning, the dead were inspected, and a flag found on the body of SM Makoto Kifayashida had his name and unit. The Americans continued to move forward and resupply. On the 20th, the U.S. Navy's 4th Special Construction Battalion arrived offshore at Lunga Roads. The 4th Special Seabees were trained as stevedores, with their primary duty to unload inbound cargo vessels and transport the material to storage areas. Their arrival relieved the GIs and sailors who had been doing the work for months. On the 22nd of January, a crisis developed at the Marmara River crossing when the 1st and 3rd Battalions, 6th Marines, encountered units of the Japanese 4th Infantry Regiment, 80 men, and the 16th Infantry, about 100 soldiers, who were beginning to move west. Nevertheless, the Japanese were more intent on leaving the miserable island than stopping the American advance. They put up resistance but continued to withdraw, leaving a few bodies for the Marines to bury. During the following week, the 6th Marines pushed ahead, running across a few enemy stragglers in the zone of the 2/6. Former Sergeant Rudolph E. Huizinga of Company C, 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, recalled, "We would move up the coast, then patrol inland, and meet the regiment again on the beach. The following day would find us doing it again, climbing over inland hills, scouting the vanishing enemy." On the 23rd of January, with the battle for Hill 27 almost over, forward elements of the 25th Infantry Division moved over rugged terrain westward toward the Kokumbona sector, an area the Americans had attacked repeatedly. The 1st Battalion, 27th Infantry, advanced north and took out a small Japanese unit occupying a former native village, then moved west again. With the Americans pounding on the doorstep, the Japanese defenders from Colonel Oka's 2nd Battalion, 124th Infantry, had managed to round up about 100 soldiers. They knew the end of the battle was near and could have joined the evacuation, yet true to the ancient Bushido warrior code, the Knights of Bushido chose to attack. As they poured down the hill, most were shot and never reached the bottom standing up. Itohei, PFC, Takeshi Arakawa of the 2nd Battalion, 228th Infantry, an aide to Major Inagaki, stated in his interrogation report of the 30th of January 1943, "When the U.S. attack started, the 2nd Battalion of the Oka unit dropped back towards headquarters. Major Inagaki thought that they would return to reinforce him, so he held his position. Colonel Oka and his staff left the strongpoint and started down the coast to evacuate. They never reached the departure site, as they were killed en route. After a week had passed, they did not return, and the U.S. forces had forged a wedge between them, isolating Inagaki's battalion. They decided to make one last attack on the U.S. positions and die in the attempt. They managed to reach the American lines, but the men were too weak to make the assault. Most of the unit was killed. Major Inagaki was shot down right next to me, and I was wounded and then captured. Perishing in the mad dash were 3 first lieutenants, 1 warrant officer, 3 master sergeants, 5 sergeants, 5 corporals, 9 lance corporals, 29 superior privates, 5 candidates for NCO, 71 privates first class, and 4 medical technicians. All were part of the defending force holding a strongpoint at the Gifu complex. The POW interrogators of Yotohei, Sup Parti, Saiichi Matsueda, 2nd Company, 228th Infantry, quoted Matsueda in their report. His company, under First Lieutenant Tomio Omasu, was reduced to about 10-12 men, but a large portion was through sickness. Also on the 23rd, 2 Tulagi-based Royal New Zealand Navy, RNZN, minesweepers, the Kiwi and Moa, were operating off Kamimbo Bay, the most northwesterly point of the island. US decoders using Ultra were reading the enemy's mail at the time, and the RNZN warships and the Cactus Air Force were alerted to the possibility of the arrival of a Japanese submarine. The I-1 under Lieutenant Sida Aichi Sakamoto, from Submarine Division 6, subsequently engaged in a fierce action that lasted more than an hour. The Kiwi rammed the sub 3 times and wrecked it. Of the 66 men aboard the sub, 19 were able to reach the shore and scamper inland. The I-1 had also been transporting an array of new codebooks. Apparently, the boat had been serving as the delivery agent for a number of stations. One of the sailors who reached the shore knew the value of the crypto material. He buried some of the codebooks and destroyed most of the others. The next morning, a party from the 2 minesweepers boarded the submarine and captured the wounded navigation officer. According to their report, they took the sub's remaining codebooks, which were turned over to the commander of the naval operating base, Guadalcanal. On the 25th of January, large flights of Betty bombers heading for Pothole Hen, Henderson Field, were interrupted by 8 F-4F and 4 P-38 aircraft led by Captain Joseph J. Foss. Although outnumbered, Foss's group shot down 4 of the enemy. The Americans fought with such determination that the Japanese returned to base without having dropped a single bomb, and Captain Foss received a Medal of Honor citation. The Americans on the ground slept well that night. While the GIs were attending to damages done and burying their dead in the Mount Austin sector, components of the newly formed CAM Division, which included the 6th Marines assigned to move west along the beach route, were periodically harassed by snipers. On the 20th of January, the 147th Infantry relieved the 182nd, which then moved into the CAM Division bivouac area. The 147th Infantry Regiment joined the 6th Marines late that day in the vicinity of the beach route. The 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, was on the right beach flank, with 2 6ths positioned on the left. In the late hours of the day, the CAM units ran into heavy fire, and orders were issued to dig in for the night. They did not know that while they were digging foxholes, the enemy was creeping up the coast, hoping to exit with their lives. The 6th Marines moved to higher ground to obtain a clearer picture of the terrain ahead, and at one juncture they encountered GIs of the 27th Infantry Regiment, who had moved through the old Japanese bivouac area at Kokumbona to join the 6th Marines on the coast. Both the 27th Infantry and the 6th Marines continued to aggressively patrol the area. Other than the 22nd of January incident involving the 1/6th and the 3/6ths, who ran across the Japanese 4th Infantry Regiment, the Marines met only a few scattered enemy troops, most ill or in poor health. The more hearty of the enemy were working their way up the coast a few miles ahead of the advancing CAM troops. On the 27th of January, the Coast Force, 6th Marines and 147th Infantry, advanced to the Bonegi River. There, the retreating enemy put up a stiff resistance to prevent the Americans from crossing. The CAM troops had not expected much fight as they moved along the coast route, because they had met only small bands of retreating Japanese who were more interested in moving off Guadalcanal than fighting. But at the Bonegi, on the west bank, was Major Keiji Yano's battalion, well dug in and determined to stonewall the advancing Americans. The 1st Battalion, 147th Infantry, attempted to cross the river near the coast but was stopped. The 3 147ths tried to cross farther upstream, but that too was unsuccessful. Strategically placed machine guns kept the soldiers from Ohio on the east side of the river. Meanwhile, Naval Gunfire Liaison Officers, NGLO, Lieutenants Ada and Carlin, aboard the Tulagi-based destroyers Wilson, DD 408, and Anderson, DD 411, were finally put to work. The lieutenants had been on board the two destroyers as gunfire experts when the ships had shot up the hulks of the four beached transports, the Kinugawa Maru, Hirokawa Maru, Yamura Maru, and Yamatsuki Maru. Each of the ships had two forward 75mm anti-aircraft guns, and now, in late January, the retreating Japanese passing by reboarded the grounded transports to fire the weapons in order to harass the advancing Americans. The Wilson and the Anderson silenced the Japanese guns, then moved west to some 2,000 yards off the Boneji River basin. The 147th Infantry Troopers pulled back, and the destroyers fired intensely into the area with their 5-inch deck guns, clearing the way for the 147th to cross the river and continue the push west. Sergeant Richard P. Bailey of H&S Company, 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, a BAR man, arrived on Guadalcanal on the 6th of January 1943. He saw more than his share of death. Our first night there was spent at Kukum near Lunga Point. For several days we remained at Kukum without any apparent direction, although patrols were sent out at night, more for training than to complete a mission. Shortly thereafter, about the second week of January, we heard scuttlebutt that we were going to join forces with the army in a unit called CAM. We, the 6th Marines, were to form the right flank of a line that included the 25th Infantry Division inland. We then moved forward to the Matanikau and established an aid station and regimental headquarters on the east bank. A couple of days later, the 6th Regiment relieved the 2nd Marines who formed the left flank of the Marines' line. Our first glimpse of the bearded, dirty, ragged 2nd Marines, without adequate footwear, brought home the fact that we were enmeshed in the war. Stark combat began a few days later when we got word that the entire line had formed and we were all to move forward. Patrols were sent out and inexperience showed up immediately as the Japanese let them go through and then closed around them. Fire raked the area from every direction. The 6th had its first taste of battle and had been hurt, including my close friend PFC, Kenneth L. Creamer, who suffered a severe wound in the left knee and thigh. The dead and wounded were evacuated to the rear aid station across the Matanikau. The dead were eventually trucked back to the cemetery and the wounded to the hospital. On one such trip back to the aid station about the middle of January, I overheard Dr. English complaining about the conditions he had to work under and wondering aloud why the 6th didn't have its own hearse, truck, to transport the dead to the rear so they wouldn't be lying around the aid station for hours. As luck would have it, the Protestant chaplain, Gordon Tollefson, was assigned a 3-4-ton truck, but no driver. Before that day was over, because I was handy and no one else was, when the regimental commander decided to make an inspection of the area, and through the persuasive powers of Doc English and 2 chaplains, I was relieved of all other duties and assigned to Chaplains Tollefson and Patrick J. O'Neill as their driver. The rest of my time on Guadalcanal was heartbreaking, as I often carried friends, like Dick Watson, K Company's supply sergeant, a very close friend, and acquaintances on that long, slow ride to the rear. The smell of death permeated everything. The bed of my truck was continuously full of maggots, while flies and ants crawled in and out of every opening in the bodies, which were covered by ponchos. As the CAM division pushed even farther up the island toward Cape Esperance, about the last week of January, regimental headquarters, the aid station, and the chaplain's tent, which we shared, were moved up and established in a coconut grove adjacent to the beach. This appeared at first glance to be an ideal spot, but it proved to be otherwise because the open area between the trees and the beach was a perfect target for aircraft, surface vessels, and artillery. Attacks occurred each day during daylight hours and frequently after dark. The proximity of the chaplain's tent to the beach gave the added advantage of being able to back the truck into the water and clean out the maggots by tossing buckets of salt water into the truck bed. Of course, this left us exposed, as well as the LCMs that brought the dead and wounded to the aid station by water. On a number of occasions, we had to provide whatever shelter we could for men on litters who were exposed to strafing aircraft. We never had a man hit, and we felt good about that. On the 26th of January, portions of the CAM division attacked the enemy from positions in and around the Poha River and moved about several hundred yards. The following day, they moved further to the next river crossing, the Nueha. By the 30th, the 6th Marines and the 147th had reached the Bonegi River, where they met a well-prepared enemy position on Hill 92, Isam Dai, and were temporarily halted while fighting a pitched battle. What the Americans encountered were the members of the 229th Infantry at the supply and bivouac area of the Tanaka Butai, who did not want to lose what foodstuffs they had cached. As Joe Michek continued west with the American Division's 132nd Infantry Regiment, reinforced, he recorded information about Japanese explosive devices. January 26th, 27. The Japanese used two types of bombs. One is a high explosive variety generally intended for damaging the airport, and the other is a personnel bomb or grass cutters, called daisy cutters. When this type of bomb explodes, it sends shrapnel fragments flying in all directions close to the ground, and it does not make a large hole. In the last 2 weeks, we have spent most of our time in deep dugouts, thank God, with log and dirt roofing. It affords plenty of protection against shrapnel. It would practically take a direct hit to kill anyone. Of course, if you are on the surface during an air raid, your chances of getting hit are excellent. During the last days of January, an ever-increasing number of Japanese transports, sea trucks, freighters, destroyers and battle wagons gathered in Simpson Harbour at Rabaul, New Britain, and at the Shortland Islands. Coast watchers warned Noumea, New Caledonia, of the build-up, causing worry at the SOPAC command there. They passed the concern to the forces on Guadalcanal. The threat was taken seriously, as SOPAC command suspected that the enemy was preparing to launch a new invasion. Thus, on the 6th of February, the 14th Army Corps recalled elements of the 25th Infantry Division, less the 161st Regiment, from the drive west. The intent was to protect the perimeter, which was now short of combat troops, and to defend the airfield against a possible new encounter from the sea. Yet, despite the threat of a new attack, the 2nd Marine Division, less the rear echelon of 2/10ths, boarded transports at Lunga Roads and departed Guadalcanal for Milk and Honey, New Zealand. We have received an order to be prepared to move at a moment's notice. Something is in store for us, and I don't think it's good. We're off on another expedition into enemy territory. We stored our barracks bags and carried full packs to the beach at Lunga Point. Here we waited. The positions we occupied in the jungle were taken over by the 164th Infantry Regiment. Our equipment for this exercise is full field packs and battle-green fatigues. Of course, we are hand-carrying our heavy weapons with a normal load of ammo. We were given an address by General Sibri, Col 377, and Lieutenant Colonel George F. Ferry, who told us what a magnificent job we did on Hill 27, and how sure they were that we would also do a good job on this mission. From the information I received, our battalion will travel by Higgins boats to the enemy's rear at the northern end of the island. There we are to establish a beachhead and place the enemy between two forces. With this stratagem by sea, we hope to clean out the island of the enemy. My company, G, was to establish the initial beachhead. Therefore, we will travel by a destroyer that we board at midnight. For the move west, the force consisted of 2nd Battalion, 132nd Infantry. Company M, anti-tank, 132nd Infantry, less 1 machine gun platoon, 1 rifle platoon of K Company, 132nd Infantry. Battery F, 10th Marines, 75mm pack howitzers. A detachment of the 65th Engineer Combat Battalion. A detachment of the Service Company, 132nd Infantry. A detachment of the Headquarters Company, 132nd Infantry. A detachment of the 26th Signal Company. A detachment of the 101st Medical Regiment. On the 1st of February, the two 132nds embarked on 5 LCTs at Kukum, Flotilla 5, LCT 58, 60, 62, 156, and 158, with supporting units carrying a 2-day supply of C rations and D bars and extra ammunition for 60mm mortars and machine gun munitions. Standing by was the Stringham APD-6, the APD that was to escort us on our journey north through the area called Iron Bottom Bay. The sea was calm as the LCTs started their journey in single file. The island looked deceptively peaceful. The mist-shrouded mountain range and palm trees along the beach were picturesque of a tropical paradise. Later that day, our convoy headed into an area known as Verahue, which was to be our landing spot. At dawn, we rounded the northwestern tip of Guadalcanal and came in from the other side. Our destroyer headed towards the shore area of an unknown lagoon. The DD halted and lowered its landing craft, and we headed for shore. I had a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach and wondered whether we would meet any resistance or not. We all disembarked quickly and moved inland. As we hit the beach about noon, the sound of aircraft engines cut the air. A twin-engine Japanese bomber came roaring over the hill and flew just above the beach palms. As we looked up, we could see the waist gunner gazing down on us. It happened so fast that the naval gunners on the APD never fired a shot, and even with our own weapons loaded and locked, we didn't fire. The bomber roared down the coastline and banked to the right in an attempt to gain altitude for a second pass over our landing area, yet flew directly over our escorting destroyer. This time the ship's fire scored a direct hit and the bomber crashed as a flaming wreck. Later reports indicated that a total of 3 aircraft were shot down during this engagement. We found that the landing area, the village of Nugu, northwest Guadalcanal, had been abandoned and many of the huts were burnt. We secured the landing area and sent out patrols in the nearby hills with negative results. They found some discarded Japanese equipment but saw no enemy. I estimated that the strength of the 2 132nds and the supporting units numbered about 1,500 men. If the enemy consolidated their forces and attacked, we were informed to hold our ground until forces moving up the beach reached our position. The 65th Engineers improved the shoreline road from Verahue to Titi, enabling supplies and precious water to move forward. The main body moved southward along a beach road that ran along the shoreline without incident to a point called Titi, another Lever Brothers plantation. On the beach we found a crashed Japanese fighter plane. Apparently it had made a forced landing. All the machine guns had been removed. Each day it was the same routine. Inch up and dig in, then repeat the same procedure the next day. This exercise continued until the 10th of February. Company F was dug in and formed a defensive position from the shore on our left flank and into the grove with Company G on the right. The jungle wall we faced was approximately 300 feet to our front. Our field kitchens were set up and we enjoyed our first hot meal in days. The ocean breeze kept the heat and humidity out of the grove. The restful afternoon was shattered by the crack of Japanese rifle fire coming from the edge of the thick underbrush. The morning of the 5th, the silence was shattered by a shell exploding when it smashed into the trunk of a palm tree and blasted near Company F's position. Everyone dove for cover. Our first impression was that the enemy had brought artillery into action, but we soon found out that our own destroyer had mistaken us for an enemy position and fired 36 rounds into our area. The firing was so close that we never heard the incoming shell fire. Was there cursing? A ceasefire was immediately ordered when a signal from shore was acknowledged. No casualties were reported. In the afternoon, a patrol from Company F was sent to probe the area along the beach road about 100 yards into the jungle. The patrol was ambushed, with a loss of 5 men and a couple native scouts. The sound of gunfire was heard, and an immediate alert was sounded. Members of the patrol made their way back to our lines along the beach road. Our supporting field artillery, the 2nd Battalion, 10th Marines, opened fire with their 75S. The sound of shells passing overhead and the exploding shells covered the ambush site and gave us the impression that a new attack was looming. Suddenly, a shrill vibrating sound was heard, and we instinctively knew that it was a short round falling in our midst. 1 killed. As night fell, tensions rose and orders were issued to remain in our foxholes regardless, and any movement would be considered an enemy probe. Our eyes strained for anything out of the ordinary, and our ears were attempting to detect any sounds different from the characteristic jungle sounds. The following morning, a patrol was organised from the 2nd Battalion and moved along the road to the ambush site. The lead scout found an enemy bayonet lying on the road, and it looked new. We saw many enemy footprints in the sand. On our patrol, we came upon the bodies of 2 of our GIs. The ants, maggots, and large blue flies had begun their aggression on their mangled remains, and a sickening stench filled the air. The other missing soldiers of that patrol were listed as MIA, missing in action. A British Vickers machine gun was found. It had been abandoned, but no ammunition. On the 6th, we continued our advance along the coast. We passed the remains of what appeared to be a mission, the Sacred Heart mission at Visail. The only visible object was a statue facing the ocean. I had a small camera and took a photo of it. It was untouched. Later, we passed the bodies of 2 enemy soldiers lying next to a heavy machine gun. In one area along the beach, we found numerous wooden landing craft. I went aboard one and found that some of the timbers had what seemed to be axe marks on some of the heavy beams. It was powered by an efficient-looking diesel engine and appeared to be well maintained. The air was filled with the stench of death as we passed many bloated and decaying bodies of the enemy lying alongside the road. Clouds of flies rose and maggots filled every body opening. Due to their decomposed condition, their cause of death was unknown. We found the body of one of our ill-fated patrol MIAs along the coast route. We covered it with a half-shelter. As night approached, we dug in along high hills that overlooked a jungle valley that extended to the beach. 2-man foxholes were the order of the day. As darkness closed in, we could hear sounds of movements and muffled rumblings of motors in the distance. I wondered why our Navy, or our Marine-attached Field Artillery Unit, F210, didn't lay down a barrage on the area. It was later found out that our radio communication equipment was broken down, and our naval escort was unable to support us at that critical juncture. Enemy movements continued all night. The 2nd Battalion, 132nd Infantry, had faced elements of 1st Lieutenant Michimori Ohei's 2nd Company, plus 2nd Lieutenant Koitsu Oichi's machine gun company. Probation Officer Saito's 1st Platoon was active in covering the Yano Battalion's withdrawal. Joe Michek's diary further describes the events. The morning, we advanced along the road into an area called Maravovo, adjacent to Kamimbo Bay. We found all types of discarded equipment, some new and scattered about, such as canteens, helmets, and web equipment, plus cases of hand grenades and mortar shells. Stacks of new collapsible boats were discovered in the brush. Outboard motors were wrapped in yellow rubberized sheets and had been buried in the sand at the water's edge. Some weapons were found, including an anti-tank rifle fed by a 10-round clip that was larger in caliber than our .50 caliber machine gun. No strong enemy opposition was encountered, but our patrols inflicted casualties on the fleeing enemy. The activity on the other coast is described by W. Marshall Cheney of Company B, 1st Battalion, 147th Infantry Regiment, at that time a segment of the CAM Division, the 19th of January. The 1st and 3rd Battalions, 147th Infantry, moved into the front lines, flanked by the 6th Marines on the right and the 182nd Infantry on the left. The formations were almost in contact with the enemy. The next morning, Company B's 1st Platoon was on the right of the regimental sector as the platoon went through the valley between hills 96 and 98. As we reached the riverbank, groups of Japanese were encountered and were full of fight. The platoon responded quickly, and when the melee was over, 17 of the enemy were felled. After arriving at Kokumbona on the 24th, we remained in reserve for a brief period, when the 14th Army Corps ordered the regiment back into action. The 6th Marines, in consort with the forces of the CAM Division, continued to move toward the Poha River, where they made contact with scattered forces of the fleeing enemy who fought a delaying action. By the 27th, the CAM Division had reached the edges of the swollen Nueha River and crossed over. On the 28th of January, in a coconut grove near Tassafaronga Point, Company A, 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, encountered an ambush while acting as the point in the advance. It was a strategic Japanese delaying tactic to facilitate their withdrawal. Company A had many casualties, including the acting commanding officer, Lieutenant Blaine P. Kerr. The 14th Army Corps added the punch of the 97th Field Artillery Battalion and Battery G of the 10th Marines to support the 147th's drive west. On the 30th of January, W.M. Cheney recorded, "As the regiment advanced through a grove, running parallel with the coast, we approached the east bank of the Boneji River. Then all hell broke loose and a full-scale battle followed. They had run into W.O. Toraji Matsumoto's 1st Platoon and the Otsuka Tai, plus members of the Yano Battalion, who were protecting the evacuation route. Artillery fire had been stepped up and help was sought from the Navy and the CAF. 2 destroyers were dispatched from Lunga Point to shell the enemy on the west bank. Half-tracks were brought up to reinforce the 1st Battalion's sector, and it became a hell of a fight. Despite our aggressiveness, the 147th, however, did not cross the Boneji River until the 5th. First Lieutenant Marvin V. Ayers of the 3rd Battalion, 147th Infantry Regiment, was the supply officer. His diary covers some of the engagements of the 3rd Battalion. Saturday, January 30th, 11th day in combat. The 147th took over part of the front lines supported by Company B, 57th Combat Engineers. They ran into resistance in the afternoon. Quite a few casualties, including Lieutenant Chadwick of Company A. The action took place around the Boneji River just this side of Tassafaronga. I saw a fellow from Company D blown up by a mortar hit. Snipers galore, bullets whizzing all around. Sunday, January 31st. Boneji River, still resistance. Battalion scattered, some forward through the coconut trees, others on the ridges to the south. Had a destroyer and aerial bombardment, plus artillery placed on Japanese positions ahead of us. The service company finally moved up today, but it was rainy. Companies A and L started over ridges 118, 120, 121, 122 and 126 to flank the Japanese, facing tough going. Company K attacked along the coast at 1600, meeting strong resistance with 5 killed and 7 wounded. 3 Japanese were killed near my kitchen bivouac by the 6th Marines. I took a platoon from Company K with a squad from Company L for guides and security, and hand-carried supplies to Companies A and L on Hill 124. We went through and then parallel to the front lines. The 1st Battalion pushed across the Boneji River, so I hoped to find a peep trail to Companies A and L, with engineers building a bridge across the river. I blazed a jeep trail to the bottom of Hill 124 and delivered hot food and water to Companies A and L. I took supplies up at dawn and established forward ammo dumps just across the Boneji River. Borrowed 10 mules from the 97th Field Artillery and took supplies to Company K on Hill 123, a rough grind. The battalion moved to the other side of Tassafaronga Point, also condition black, possibly an enemy invasion was on, contracted for mules for tomorrow. I took supplies by mule to Company K. The battalion held fast to be relieved tomorrow by the 161st Infantry, relieved by the 161st Infantry, 3rd Battalion by noon, returned to the rest area near the Lesage Trail where we started 18 days ago. The 161st Infantry took over the westward drive near the Umasani River, nearly 1.5 miles west of Tassafaronga, relieving the 147th. By nightfall, 3 161sts had reached Doma Cove, while the 2nd Battalion moved into positions adjacent to Hill 127 and 123 as the 147th Regiment moved out. Meanwhile, 161st moved just west of the Boneji River. The areas around the Segilao, Tambalolo, and Umasani rivers were former Japanese bivouac areas. At the Sasa River basin, a group of the enemy was seen moving west, but they scattered as the 161st Infantry pressed its advantage. The advance continued, and the Tanamba River, nearly 3 miles east of Cape Esperance, was crossed on the morning of February 9th. The 161st's drive to the Cape began on the central coast of the island at the former lookout post of the 81st Guard Unit at Taivu Point, then past Coley Point, Longa Point, Point Cruz, Kokumbona and Doma Cove. The GIs moved to occupy the Japanese positions in the Cape Esperance area. At 1632, the 1st Battalion, 161st Infantry Regiment, and the advance elements, Companies E and G, of the 2nd Battalion, 132nd, met at the east bank of the Tanamba River in Tanaro village. Back at Coley Point, the area headquarters for the 25th Infantry Division, Sergeant Charles Corr, R2 Section, 161st Infantry, wrote in his diary, "At 18:35 this day, as the rain dropped down on our dark tent roof, and we all sat around listening to Major Robert Louis Stevenson saying, 'Best news I've heard in a year.'" Then he turned. "Can you keep it? It's unofficial still. The phone rings. He answers quickly. "Yeah, okay. Well, it's official. Our forces have met near Cape Esperance, and it appears all Japanese forces on the island have been killed or evacuated." Although air, sea and land patrols continued for months, officially the Guadalcanal campaign was over. Nevertheless, Americans continued to die from occasional snipers. It was not until 1949 that the last Japanese surrendered. He had hid in the jungle and had stolen food from native gardens during the evening hours. He still had his rusty rifle. In February 1943, the Japanese implemented an evacuation plan, the Keigo Sakusen, to remove their troops from Guadalcanal. Director of the Operations Section of the 1st Division, Army General Staff Colonel Yoichiro Sanada, had visited Guadalcanal between 17 and the 25th of December 1942 to assess the conditions. He was appalled at the state of the Emperor's troops, who were unkempt and starving. He concluded that the losses the 17th Army had suffered were too great to continue the campaign, and believed the army should be withdrawn as soon as possible. Sanada returned to Rabaul with this decision. On the 29th of December, acting on Sanada's analysis, Imperial General Headquarters formulated plans to evacuate Guadalcanal due to the drain on the Empire. The Emperor was informed of the situation. The Japanese Navy could not land enough food to adequately feed the troops. The 17th Army faced disaster, and the surface fleet had lost many vessels attempting to reinforce the island. The General Staff concluded it was better to halt further losses. The Japanese moved quickly to implement the Keigo operation. Director of the 1st Division, Army General Staff, Major General Ayabe Kitsuhu, and Colonel Yoichiro Sanada arrived at Rabaul on the 9th of January with orders for the 8th Area Army to promptly evacuate the 17th Army from Guadalcanal. On the 3rd of January, Vice ADM, Shigeru Fukustomi, Chief of the 1st Department, Imperial General Staff, Navy Department, arrived at Truk Atoll, headquarters of the Combined Fleet. The Chiefs of Staff for the Southeast Area Fleet and the 8th Fleet discussed the intricate plan and coordinated the Keigo concept until late that night. The following day, the Emperor issued the decree to withdraw from Guadalcanal Island, followed by Army Order Nos. 732 and 733 and Navy Order No. 23. Order No. 733 stated that the 8th Area Army would coordinate the withdrawal with the Imperial Navy. The key points of the Army-Navy Central Agreement were: the troops on Guadalcanal were to be evacuated between the end of January and the beginning of February. The troops were to retrench, bringing their advanced line to Munda, New Georgia Islands, in the Western Solomons, about 160 miles from Guadalcanal, and north to the Santa Isabel Islands. The New Georgia Islands had been part of the overall strategy long before the plan to evacuate Guadalcanal. Some Imperial forces had been diverted to Munda to maintain a backup base. The New Georgia chain, a group of 11 islands, also had a barge way station when Gizo Island Atoll was briefly occupied in March 1942. On the 12th of November 1942, the 2nd Battalion, 229th Infantry, Major Giichi Sato, 38th Infantry Division, had landed on Munda from 5 warships as a defence unit for a naval workforce. The landing was noticed by the Allies, and on the morning of the 13th of November, 12 Guadalcanal-based aircraft bombed the area. The 22nd Construction Unit landed 3 days later, on the 16th of November, and the 22nd Setsueitai began working on a secret landing strip on Munda Island, cleverly concealed beneath palm trees. The USAAF 4th Photo Reconnaissance and Mapping Group detected the hidden airstrip on the 5th of December and alerted air intelligence officers. The New Zealand airmen, recently added to the Cactus Air Force, flew their bombers without a normal fighter escort. F. David Tribe of No. 3 Reconnaissance Bombardment Squadron, RNZAF, described the situation. Munda Island had no significance until an American reconnaissance plane reported that a runway had been built on it almost overnight, apparently covered with the tops of palm trees. These treetops were to be removed, and there would be an operational airstrip. I decided to look at Munda, which was not quite operational. One day at midday, we flew right along the palm-covered strip at 200 feet and dropped a stick of bombs, depth charges actually, setting fire to several buildings at the end of the runway. This was, in fact, the first Allied attack on Munda. The result was that I got called down by the CO for wasting 6,500 elbul depth charges, as it was the whole stock for the New Zealand squadron. On the 5th of December, Japanese sub-chasers landed 1,200 troops on Gato, along with bags of rice. 5 days later, 8 destroyers delivered 250 sealed drums of food by pushing them off each ship's fantail, hoping the tide would carry them to shore, an innovative method to supply the starving Japanese, yet still insufficient. During unloading, 4 American PT boats disrupted the operation and engaged the Imperial Navy, resulting in PT-43 and PT-112 taking hits and being lost. On the 11th of December, the 8th Area Army issued Group Order No. 81 to the 17th Army, and the Yano Battalion was hurriedly organized and assembled on the 10th of January to support the evacuation. A fresh contingent of soldiers from Rabaul, the Yano Battalion under Major Keiji Yano, was composed of men in their 30s. Yano, a company commander during the China incident, had led his battalion to Guadalcanal. The battalion was a mix of 750 green troops with some experienced officers, including First Lieutenant Michimori Ohei, First Lieutenant Masashi Gomi, and Second Lieutenant Hiroshi Otsuka. PO2C Sankichi Kaneda wrote about the Yano Battalion. The Yano Battalion of the 38th Division, the last to land on Gato, consisted of draftees averaging 32 years of age, poorly trained, lightly armed, and in brand new uniforms. This was at the time when we were awaiting evacuation, so seeing this new unit made us uneasy. We didn't know then that the Yano Butai was to be our rear guard for the evacuation operation, and their sacrifices ensured that we escaped enemy attacks on our backs as we withdrew, allowing the evacuation to proceed smoothly. The 17th Army's radio code personnel were seriously ill with Guadalcanal sickness, suspending radio operations. To resolve this, the 8th Area Army assigned part of the 8th Army Communication Unit, including 1 Army radio platoon from the 14th Signal Regiment, 1 Army wire platoon, and a squad from the 15th Signal Regiment to the Yano Battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Kumao Imoto, a staff officer with the 8th Area Army, and Major Tadahiko Sato, along with 2 code specialists and 6 enlisted men, were part of the team. On the 12th of January, the Yano Battalion departed Simpson Harbour, Rabaul, on destroyers bound for Guadalcanal via the Shortland Islands. They arrived at Faizi Island on the 13th of January. Major Sato and Colonel Imoto carried identical Keigo papers on different destroyers to ensure the delivery of instructions if one vessel was disabled or sunk. At the Faizi command post, Colonel Imoto met with Staff Officer Major Inosuke Yemura and revealed the Keigo operation plan. Satisfied with Faizi cooperation, Imoto proceeded to explain the plan to the 17th Army. Despite initial hesitation from the Army staff, General Hayakutake asserted, "Nothing shall prevent me from doing my duty." That evening, Colonel Haruo Konuma of the 17th Army went to the front lines to explain the evacuation order to the various commanders. At midnight, he delivered the order and the plan for its execution to Lieutenant General Tadayoshi Sano, commander of the 38th Infantry Division, at his headquarters. Following that, Konuma called upon Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, commander of the 2nd Division, and presented him with the plan. While Colonel Konuma had been preparing for his visit to Guadalcanal to deliver the Emperor's order to evacuate, PO2C Kaneda recorded in his diary the renewed initiative to resupply the haggard troops, an effort of too much, too late. He notes, "The suspended supply by destroyers was resumed on the 11th, with them delivering provisions in sealed rubber bags. On the 14th of January, more provisions in drums and rubber bags were delivered by destroyers. Apparently, they were put in the water offshore for the tide, wind, and waves to float ashore." However, Kaneda's earlier entry had underscored the sense of desperation the troops had been feeling. November and December is mostly about trying to survive, occasional small units being landed, efforts by the Navy to deliver supplies, and occasional sorties of no consequence. Destroyers delivered rice in metal drums overnight. Men on shore would light bonfires to guide them to areas of friendly forces. Kaneda later again wrote, listing the ironically more frequent resupply runs for the troops about to be taken off the island. The 26th of January. Under a half-moon, submarine Wanma-26 set afloat about 15 tons of provisions in rubber bags and safely withdrew. The 27th of January. Just as the night before, submarine Y3 set afloat rubber bags full of provisions and safely withdrew. The 29th of January, submarine Y3 left rubber bags of provisions afloat for us, but while taking aboard some passengers for the return trip, was attacked by enemy torpedo boats and sunk. Our landing barges rescued the crew and passengers. The 30th of January. At Esperance, submarine I-19 set afloat 25 tons of provisions and safely withdrew. The 31st of January, submarine 120 set afloat about 25 tons of provisions and took aboard emergency passengers on its return. By the 16th of January, the 16th Infantry had withdrawn to the area adjacent to Rove Creek, and by late afternoon on the following day, it had moved to an area known as Hyakutake Hill, a line east of Isamugawa, White River, but still on the coast. 2 days later, General Maruyama issued movement directives to carry out the evacuation blueprint. Combat forces were to clear the coast route of any enemy, so that the components of the 38th Division, the freshest major unit, could move to Cape Esperance with surety. However, a few days later, the 38th Infantry Division issued Order No. 304 authorizing the move of the division to Tenaro. Although the 38th Division had issued orders to prepare to move, the commander of the 38th Transport Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Hideichi Yabuta, did not inform his men. Compounding the situation, on the 3rd of February, Yabuta died, and the acting commanding officer, Captain Gunji Tokunaga, likewise did not pass the evacuation order to his subordinates, but rather told them they were leaving for a final battle at the Segilau River. On the 25th of January, elements of the 4th Infantry Regiment, 80 men, and the 16th Infantry Regiment, 100 men, were to engage the Americans in an attempt to stall their advance. While the 4th and 16th Infantry were jabbing at the GIs, 20 officers of the 17th Army Rear Echelon disbanded their headquarters at Tassafaronga and headed for Esperance. At sunset, elements of the 38th Division began moving forward with a detachment on the right flank as a protection screen, while elements of the Yano Battalion advanced to Kokumbona. There they engaged the Americans. Meanwhile, elements of the 38th Division had arrived at Tenaro just after sunset on the 22nd of January. However, the commander, seeing difficulties, ordered one unit to the front lines to remain in position, specifically to make contact with the 2nd Division, which was to maintain coastal security until the evening of the 23rd. Elements of the 2nd Division would spar with the Americans around hills 420 and 920, and although the Americans were pushing, it was not hard enough, thus letting the Japanese flee. the 16th and 29th Regiments of the 2nd Division were to continue to be in command of the exodus, while allowing the main body of the division to move west. At one juncture, the depleted 4th Infantry Regiment was also ordered to protect the withdrawal. The next day, the 24th of January, about 2,200 soldiers, the rear element of the 38th Division, moved from the left bank of the Seguilao River and proceeded to the Cape Esperance evacuation area to assemble there. In support of these operations, the Gashima Guard Unit, elements of the 81st and 84th Guard Units, was to strengthen positions around Tassafaronga, while the 1st Shore Patrol Unit, a provisional force, strengthened positions around the Seguilao. By the 25th, portions of the 2nd and 38th Infantry Divisions were in the vicinity of the Seguilao River's left bank area and formed a line to secure it. The 1st Shore Patrol Unit was responsible for receiving units moving into the area. On the 27th, the 17th Army issued an order to the 38th Division to gather in the vicinity of Ariarij and Camimbo Bay by the morning of the 29th. The 17th Army issued another order at 1,000 on the 28th to the Navy's 1st Ship Transport Unit to embark the 38th Division, now located in the vicinity of Esperance and Camimbo Bay, on the 31st. Meanwhile, on the morning of the 29th, the Llano Battalion retreated from the Bonegi River basin to approximately 800 yards west of the old 17th Army headquarters at Tassafaronga. What the Matsumoto Company of the Llano Butai faced was the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 147th Infantry Regiment, elements of the 6th Marines, and their half-tracks. However, after each cautious advance, sometimes only 1,000 yards, the Americans would dig in for the night, and when darkness fell, the Japanese would move out. No one in the 14th Army Corps could read the telltale signs that the Japanese were leaving, even when hundreds of decomposed bodies were found on the trails west, along with scattered war material. To protect the evacuation, the 8th Fleet had carefully watched the movements of the U.S. fleet. On the 30th of January, the commander of the 21st Submarine Group reported that no enemy vessels were in Lunga Harbour. However, on the following day, the 31st, the RXN communication base reported to the 8th Fleet that 2 transports, 2 destroyers, and 1 ship resembling a light cruiser were anchored off Guadalcanal's Lunga Point. On that morning as well, the Tokyo Express had landed the Kure 6th SNLF at Munda Island in the New Georgias, boosting the combat strength there to 2,223 troops. The Guadalcanal evacuation plans called for all the troops to move out under the cover of darkness, with strict discipline and security to be maintained. The very sick and incapacitated were to be left behind. Any heavy vehicles and artillery pieces that the troops could not bring out with them were to be destroyed, though each man was to retain his personal weapons. The commanders were to explain to the troops that the move was in preparation for a future offensive. Important documents were to be carried safely and all others burned. Material of no further value was to be buried. However, the physical condition of the Japanese troops had deteriorated so greatly that much of the heavy equipment was not buried as ordered but simply discarded along the route. As they advanced westward, the Japanese were pursued and nagged each day by the Americans, not far behind. On the 31st of January, the 8th Area Army decided to postpone the evacuation by 1 day to ensure success. At 2300 on the 1st of February, the 17th Army issued an order to the 2nd Division to carry out the evacuation operation. At that time, Colonel Yutaka Matsuda, the newly appointed commander of the 28th Infantry Regiment, came under the direct control of the 17th Army. He had previously commanded the 28th Regiment at Asahigawa, Japan. Colonel Matsuda's rear guard group now consisted of the Llano Butai, Major Kenji Ishido's battalion, the 38th Howitzer Regiment, a heavy artillery unit, and part of the 45th Field Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion. What the U.S. Navy possessed at the Lunga roadstead in the way of warships made little difference to rear ADM. Tomiji Koyanagi, commander of Destroyer Squadron 2. He had relieved rear ADM. Raizo Tanaka on the 31st of December. Tanaka, godfather of the Tokyo Express, was returning to Japan for an assignment with the Naval General Staff. The new commander was confident that his sailors would easily pluck the 17th Army off RXN. In early February, 2 weeks after the Yano Butai had landed, the Maizura 4th SNLF, a veteran unit on Guadalcanal, moved to the Tanaro area and became the Naval Embarkation Supervision Unit, charged with the responsibility of escorting all the evacuees to the waiting destroyers. This Tokubetsu Rikusentai force had reached Guadalcanal on the 15th of October 1942, at which time it had a strength of 824 members. By the time it was to support the evacuation project, its roster had dropped to 361, the result of casualties and disease. The SNLF unit was under Sidada Namihira Sasakawa, who was placed in charge of the Cape Esperance evacuees. Sidada Tamao Shinohara was named Kamimbo Area Supervisory Chief. Commander Shinohara had been a staff officer with both the 11th Air Fleet and the 8th Fleet, and had come to Guadalcanal as the Japanese Navy liaison officer for the Kageyoshi operation. A 30-man detachment led by W.O. Hideo Kageyu of the 84th Guard Unit had manned dual anti-aircraft guns at Esperance for the past month, and nearby were the remnants of the 11th and the 13th construction units, whose members had been helping unload supplies. Both formations had been on the island since July and were anxious to leave. Lieutenant Akira Tanabe, the ranking officer of the 84th Guard Unit, was in charge of key evacuation arrangements for the island's original naval components, assisted by W.O. Tetsuzo Nakamura of the 81st Guard Unit Mountain Gun Platoon. By the 2nd of February, as the veterans prepared to leave the Island of Death, each unit began moving out by sunset to assemble at their designated embarkation points. The evacuation was carried out in 3 stages during the dark of night on 2, 3, 4, 5 and 7 the 8th of February. The first units to be uplifted were elements of the 38th Division, the newest complement to have arrived on the island. The next movement involved the 2nd Division, and the last took miscellaneous formations. Each destroyer had large white numbers freshly painted on the vessel's bow that would be clearly visible to the Japanese Navy men ferrying the evacuees to their respective ships. The operation plans seemed to have left nothing to chance. The first evacuation run of 20 destroyers departed Rabaul Harbour at 0900, precisely on schedule. At 1600, however, the flotilla was attacked by Allied bombers and fighters just north of Kolombangara Island. The flagship, Makinami, with rear ADM, Shintaro Hashimoto on board, was hit and suffered slight damage. The Fumizuki towed it back to the Shortlands, and Rear Admiral Hashimoto was forced to switch his flag to the Shirayuki. The first run, which had boarded 4,935 men, 441 of the IJN, involved the 3rd Combination Destroyer Group. It included the 10th Squadron of the 10th Destroyer Division and the 17th Destroyer Division. The lookout sector, or guard force, the Kawakaze, Shirayuki, Maikaze, Kuroshio, and Fumizuki, remained off the Tanaro waters to watch for the U.S. Navy. The Satsuki and the Nagasaki Nagatsuki of the 16th Destroyer Division mounted guard duty off the coast of Kamimbo Bay. The pickup destroyers assigned to pluck the remnants of the 17th Army off Tanaro Point included the Kazagumo, Yugumo, Akigumo, Tanikaze, Hamakaze, Makikumo, Urakaze, and Isokaze, replacing the Udachi. The Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Oshio, and Arashio picked up the veterans waiting at Kamimbo Bay. The 17th Army headquarters boarded one of the first formations to depart. They made certain they were going to leave and embarked on the Isokaze with 142 remaining members of the 192 that had landed in October. 17 had been killed in action, 1 died of wounds, and the others died of sickness. The 2nd Division headquarters was aboard the Hamakaze, while the balance of the division, 2,647 members, was spread among the other destroyers. To combat any disruption in the evacuation plan, the 2nd Fleet Battle Group, commanded by Vice ADM Nobutake Kondo, moved out of the truck anchorage. It was sent to divert the U.S. Navy's attention from the evacuation site and was well prepared to take on the Americans. The battleships Congo and Haruna were backed by the heavy cruisers Atago, Takao, Myoko, and Haguro, and by the light cruisers Jintsu, Agano, and Nagara. The escort destroyers included the Kagero, Asagumo, Shigura, Suzumaze, Samidare, Oshio, Hatsuyuki, Shikinami, Arashio, and Arashi. For additional safety, 2 aircraft carriers were added, the Junyo and Zuiho, supported by the supply vessels Nippon Maru and the Kenyo Maru. On the 2nd of February, however, the destroyers Asagumo and Samidare developed engine trouble and had to return to Shortland Bay. The only thorn in the side of the Imperial Navy as they travelled to Guadalcanal was the Tulagi-based motor torpedo boat Flotilla 1 with its PT boats, which attacked the evacuation armada. The PT boats believed that the island was being reinforced again, and their task was to disrupt any Japanese warships. They and the Cactus Air Force harassed the evacuation fleet, but their little stings did not counter the withdrawal. The Tonaro evacuation group arrived off the island at 2050, and the Kamimbo Bay destroyers arrived at 2200. The sailors from the Maizura 4th SNLF, Naval Embarkation Supervision Unit, eased the process for the soldiers by tacking signs to trees, showing the assembly point for each unit, and led the evacuees to the barges. Each barge had a petty officer in charge, and 1 seaman assigned to transport the veterans to the waiting vessels. The destroyers were not anchored, but were kept adrift in the event of attack by motor torpedo boats, and this move paid off handsomely, as no destroyers were lost. Nevertheless, while the Japanese troops were withdrawing from the nightmare that had been Gato, the U.S. Army, on the southwestern side of the island at Beaufort Bay, was watching. Yet for some unknown reason, during the 8-day evacuation, the U.S. Navy was dead in the water. They never appeared to halt the exodus. First Lieutenant John M. George of Company G, 2nd Battalion, 132nd Infantry, was there. It was the most interesting and eerie night that I spent on Guadalcanal, that night on a ridgetop overlooking Beaufort Bay. It was also one of the most memorable examples of lost opportunity I have ever seen. A Japanese destroyer or submarine pulled into the bay just after dusk and took on a number of evacuees. All sorts of craft, boats powered by outboard motors, rowboats, life rafts, landing barges, all were used in effecting the escape of several hundreds of Japanese. One of the principal embarkation points for the operation was within spitting distance of us, less than 300 yards below and to our front. Yet we could do nothing. We did not have the ammunition to fire blindly. We had only a few rounds of 60mm mortar shells. No machine gun or rifle ammunition to blaze away at area targets. But we were sitting and watching hundreds of Japanese troops leaving an island that should have been their final resting place. The most tantalizing factor was that we had our artillery in position, ready to bring deadly fire to bear on the closely observed enemy. We could have engineered a wonderful slaughter with a few rounds of high explosive. But it was the ancient and honourable military problem of communication. The damned radio always weakened as night set in. Just a characteristic of that particular set, the M511. Geisel, Captain Raymond A., HQ, 2, 132, struggled heroically all night to make contact with the force, but luck was not with him. Lieutenant Colonel Yoshihatsu Onizuka, commander of the 3rd Independent Trench Mortar Battalion, arrived on Guadalcanal on the 7th of October 1942. His gunners were summoned to the evacuation area to help protect the withdrawal. The 6th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Battalion and the Moritami Butai were also part of the blocking force intended to hold back the Americans, with all evacuation formations falling under the direct command of Colonel Matsuda of the 28th Infantry Regiment. Between the 25th of January and the 7th of February, elements of the American CAM Division advanced westward at a snail's pace, averaging a daily gain of about 870 yards. Matsuda's forces succeeded in stalling the GIs while Japanese troops continued heading for the Kamimbo evacuation site, waiting their turn to withdraw. However, on the night of the 2nd of February, as the first echelon of the evacuation fleet was in full swing, they were attacked at 0540 by aircraft from the Cactus Air Force. The proficient Japanese Navy gunners kept the planes high overhead, and thus the fleet sustained no major damage. One destroyer, the Makikumo, ran into a mine, which momentarily slowed the fleet. The group continued at 30 to 33 knots, reaching Shortland Harbour at 0900. The U.S. Navy had laid mines between Doma Cove and Cape Esperance in anticipation of inhibiting invasion efforts and disrupting the supply point, but no enemy warships were caught in their traps until the Makikumo encountered one. The Yugumo came to the rescue, attaching a line, and was in the process of assisting the stricken destroyer to the Shortland base when the Makikumo began taking on water off Savo Island and sank. Meanwhile, the evacuation fleet was attacked off Savo Island by 6 PT boats from Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2, but the squadron's craft did not come away unscathed. PT-111 took a direct hit from a destroyer's 5-inch shell, and PT-37 and PT-123 were smashed during the melee. The second evacuation run, on 5 February, was carried out in perfect weather. The night was dark and moonless, with only slight swells. Admiral Hashimoto in the Shirayuki considered the perfect conditions a good omen. 2 platoons of the Yano Butai, along with others, managed to reach the evacuation area and quickly boarded the waiting destroyers, 3,921 men, 327 of the IJN. The ships headed for the Faisi Island roadstead, but came under attack by 30 aircraft from Henderson Field. The Maikaze was the only casualty, receiving slight damage with 1 sailor killed and 2 wounded. It was towed back to the Shortland base by the Nagatsuki. Again, the 10th Destroyer Squadron and the 17th Destroyer Division were part of the transport group, which also included the Tanaro protection destroyers Shirayuki, Asayuki, Kuroshio, Samidare, and Kawakaze. The recovery vessels for pickup were the Kazegumo, Akigumo, Urakaze, Isokaze, Yugumo, Tanekaze, and Hamakaze. At 1725, the Shirayuki developed engine trouble, and Admiral Hashimoto was forced to transfer his flag to the Kawakaze. The Kamimbo Bay Lookout Security Force consisted of the Satsuki, Nagatsuki, and Fumizuki, while the pickup fleet was the Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Arashio, and Oshio. Both the Tanaro and Kamimbo Bay pickup forces reached their assigned areas at 2050. A typical unit evacuation was that of 1st Lieutenant Akio Tani's 2nd Company, 7th Heavy Field Artillery Regiment. He arrived at the Kamimbo Bay evacuation point on the 1st of February, one of 8 artillerymen, the only survivors of the original 154 that had landed in October 1942 from Rabaul. When they boarded the destroyer Oshio on the 4th, one of Tani's men, Pursuiter Yoshihiro Miyazaki, was so weak that he had great difficulty with the Jacob's ladder and fell into the ocean, but he was rescued. The evacuation of Sergeant Hisakichi Hara of the 1st Battalion, 230th Infantry, was also characteristic of the efficiency of the Japanese plan. Hara had arrived on Guadalcanal on the 15th of October 1942 with about 1,000 others. When he reached the evacuation area on the first day of February, only 60 men from his battalion remained alive. Their pickup was prompt, owing to the competence of the Naval Embarkation Group at both the Kamimbo Bay and Cape Esperance points, and as soon as the evacuees were boarded, the rescue destroyers quickly departed. All the ships were crowded, but many soldiers were no doubt grateful to be leaving. Some of the unfortunate on board died only a few hours after departure and were buried at sea. The lucky ones eventually made it to Aventa, Bougainville. The final evacuation run of 7 to the 8th of February uplifted 1,796 veterans, including 75 IJN. The 3rd Destroyer Squadron handled the Cape Esperance area, and the 10th Squadron took on the Kamimbo Bay sector. The ships weighed anchor at Faisi Island at 0930 on the 7th. At 15:45, they were attacked by a mass of 35 aircraft from the Cactus Air Force while just off the pickup site. The fleet took only minor damage as the gunners kept the planes at a distance. The destroyer Isokaze, which had been part of the first 2 successful evacuation runs, was now part of the final effort. The destroyer received slight damage from the air attack, and 10 sailors were killed and 14 wounded, but the steadfast ship continued on its journey. The Yano Butai lost 101 men while covering the withdrawal, yet they finally arrived safely at the Shortland Naval Base at 0758 on the 8th. W.O. Toraji Matsumoto, Commander Masaryu Company of the Yano Battalion, described the evacuation role. On the 7th of February, we spent the last day in the forest jungle, keeping guard and trying to rest up as much as possible. Soldiers had received plenty of rice and canned foods from the provision station and had their fill for the first time since landing here on Guadalcanal. They even had the luxury of warmed milk. It is regrettable that all these goods brought on land could not be carried to the front line and distributed before now. The Sekiro areas, which we passed through the day before yesterday, and the opposite side, which is the Maravovo district, seem to be having an artillery attack that began this morning. We hear the echo of explosions, but there is no sign of them bombing us. What they heard was the U.S. Navy bombardment in error of the positions held by the GIs of the 132nd Infantry. That afternoon, all Japanese NCOs and soldiers were ordered to bury their weapons and equipment, except knives. We were informed, "Tonight at 2100 hours, our destroyers will come to carry out the last evacuation team." After sunset, before it got too dark, the barge engineer officer made the boarding arrangements. We proceeded quietly to the boarding area. At 19:30, we were led aboard and jammed onto a big barge with absolutely no room for standing. If the enemy sensed what we were doing, we would have been in big trouble. The work went on secretly in the night's darkness. No one talked, of course, not even a cough. Time goes slow when you wait. We waited and waited, but no destroyer. Is this really possible? Fear takes army soldiers as soon as they give up their weapons. They must all be thinking of the same thing as their uneasy looks are cast on the dark horizon at sea. Suddenly over to the west of us, fierce shelling started at the shore around Maravovo. Oh no, we can't move an inch on this barge. At sea, muzzles of big guns shot out flames. This was actually a 36-plane Cactus Air Force attack on the convoy. Sparks from the explosion looked quite astonishing, to say the least. Soon I could hear the engine sound of an American torpedo boat speeding east. Soldiers waiting to go on board took a hard swallow. The artillery shelling stopped, and the torpedo boat disappeared in the dark sea. All gave a deep sigh of relief. 10 minutes seemed like an hour. Some time passed. Blue, luminous signals offshore began flashing on and off. It's a signal from the destroyer we have been waiting for. The landing barges started engines in unison and moved rapidly toward the signal. Soon we arrived at a huge black destroyer. On deck, sailors were calling with a megaphone, "Ahoy! It's over here!" The ship we approached was a destroyer, Satsuki. It looked big enough to be a cruiser and gave me an assured feeling. The barge was brought alongside the destroyer and a rope ladder was dropped. I let the soldiers climb on board. Some, who have exhausted their physical strength, are having difficulty climbing the rope ladder. Sailors lie on their stomachs and hold out their hands to pull up soldiers. I remained until last. I made sure the only men left on board were those who worked on the vessel and grabbed the rope ladder. I tried to climb, but oh, how heavy my body felt. Did my body weaken this badly? I put forth all energy I had left and climbed up on deck on my own. Led by a sailor, I went inside and sat down. My pocket watch showed 21:30. I took a communication paper and a pencil out of the pocket bag and recorded 21:30. Farewell, more than 20,000 souls sleeping in indignation. Farewell. After completing the last evacuation, the destroyer left the coast of Guadalcanal with its engines roaring. The destroyer went west at full speed. A sailor brought out large rice balls, almost as big as an infant's head, in a basket and gave one with pickled ginger to each soldier. I got one and took a big bite. How good that rice ball tasted! I will never forget that taste as long as I live. As I ate, I also tasted the true reality of being rescued. In the 3 evacuation efforts, the deck plates of the destroyers were crowded with soldiers. Some of the last to depart were 264 members of the 28th Infantry Regiment, who left 1,945 of their comrades dead somewhere on Guadalcanal. The advanced echelon of the 28th Infantry, 916 soldiers, had been the first of the Imperial foot soldiers to arrive, and the battered remnants of the 28th were the last to leave. First Lieutenant Genjiru Inui of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Company was evacuated by the Tokitsukaze on the last run. His story is one overlaid with anticipation and apprehension. On the 4th of February, the second evacuation trip, he had reached the embarkation zone and was fortunate enough to board one of the landing craft. However, he was ordered off the boat by his commander, Captain Isao Nakaoka, and directed to assist in gathering the remains of Major Kitano's battalion, including remnants of the Ichiki Shitai, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki. Lieutenant Inui finally was able to evacuate on the last run on the 7th with 40 members of the 28th Infantry Regiment. Inui's company had landed on the island on the 25th of August 1942 with 100 men. 24 survived. The remaining complement of the Mysura 4th SNLF, one of the covering and embarkation supervising units, also was able to leave on the 7th. W.O. Tetsuzo Nakamura's howitzer gun platoon was part of the 81st Guard Unit, one of the original garrison units. The 21 men of the 81st that survived included Nakamura and all members of his platoon. Of the 84th Guard Unit, which was renamed from the Kure 3rd SNLF on the 1st of July 1942, 40 survived, with 53 being KIA since the 25th of November 1942. The ever-alert lookout destroyer covering force on the 7th, the vessels guarding against any adverse conditions, consisted of twice the number involved in the pickup. It included the Shirayuki, Asagumo, Kazegumo, Urakaze, Kuroshio, Oshio, Nagatsuki, Hamakaze, Samidare, Arashio, Tanikaze, and the ever-present Isokaze. The Yugumo and Akigumo had been detailed to embark the troops in the Russell Islands. A special detachment of 300 troops from the 38th Infantry Division had landed there on the 28th of January, in case the island had to be used as an alternate evacuation point. 2 naval machine gun companies reinforced this unit, which then assumed the name Russell Islands Occupation Unit. Rakata Bay, Santa Isabel Island, also had been considered as an alternate staging area because Gizo was already an established barge relay base. However, the Gizo plan was discarded in favour of using the Russell Islands, which were closer to Guadalcanal. The Imperial Navy took a major risk in going directly to Guadalcanal and won, perhaps due to their meticulous coordination. The Allies would later meet some of these same soldiers and sailors on the beaches of New Georgia Island and in the jungles of Bougainville. The assistant navigating officer on the Satsuki noted the evacuees' free ride away from Guadalcanal with little American military interference. My first relation with Guadalcanal Island was the withdrawal operation of the Army forces from the island to Buin, in the southern part of Bougainville Island on the 1st of February 1943, actually 2-3 February. We had left the shortland anchorage at 0915 for the island with full speed, adjusting the arrival time to Cape Esperance. We, of course, had expected a fierce counterattack by US Air Sea forces before and after the operation. However, I do not know the reason why, but we met only a few aircraft and torpedo boats, by which we had not been damaged at all. The next morning at 10:15, we returned safely back to the shortland anchorage. After that, 2 more operations with the same number of destroyers on the 5th and the 7th had been carried into effect. There were some incredible points during that operation, one of which was that we had no serious attack by the US forces. The Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal ranks as one of the most successful retreats of the war, attributable, perhaps at last, to adept planning and seamanship. When the evacuees reached the shortlands, they were divided into 2 groups. The very sick soldiers were immediately transported to Rabaul for hospitalization, and the healthier individuals were transferred to Erventa, Bougainville. The Japanese Navy personnel landed at Bougainville, the headquarters of the 1st Base Force. Japanese personnel evacuated from Guadalcanal, Imperial Japanese Navy, Sasebo 5th SNLF 23, Maizuru 4th SNLF 361, 81st Guard Unit, INCL 5 patients, 21, 84th Guard Unit, 40. 11th Construction Unit, 228, 13th Construction Unit, 170. Transport crews, civilians, 27, total IJN, 870. Imperial Japanese Army, HQ 17th Army, 142. 2nd Infantry Division, 2,647. 38th Infantry Division, 2,473. 35th Brigade, 618. 28th Infantry Regiment, 264. Under 17th Army, 1,666. Line of communication. Hospital, 480. Army Transport Unit, 1,500. Total IJA, 9,770. After the withdrawal was completed, Vice ADM, Nobutake Kondo's battle group returned to anchor at Truk. They had manoeuvred in the vicinity of Gurinichi Island and were prepared to respond in force should the enemy interfere. The American surface fleet was deployed in an area 300 miles southeast of Guadalcanal, out of carrier aircraft range. The commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet had ordered one segment to proceed 350 miles north of Guadalcanal as a diversion to lure the Americans away if necessary. The submarine screen, after sweeping the seas southeast of Espiritu Santo Island, New Hebrides Islands, was to attack enemy vessels in the area of New Caledonia. By the 8th of February, Kondo's advanced battle force had moved some 550 miles north of Guadalcanal, when orders from the Combined Fleet directed them to return to the Truk anchorage. They reached Truk by the 9th, just as the Americans discovered that the Japanese were evacuating instead of reinforcing. The war on Guadalcanal did not come to an abrupt halt because the soldiers had departed, for hundreds had been left behind who were too ill or too weak to make the evacuation point on time. During the next few months, individuals and small roving bands were found. Some killed themselves for fear of falling into the enemy's hands, others fought with whatever weapons they had, and some simply surrendered, too sick to fight back. They indeed were the wise ones. The bewildered and exhausted Japanese survivors called Guadalcanal Jigoku no Shima, Hell's Island. The equally war-weary Marines referred to the campaign as our time in hell. Both were right. On the 7th of August 1942, the U.S. Marines, Navy and Coast Guard launched the first major Pacific Allied offensive of World War II in the British Solomon Islands Protectorate. It became a complex campaign in which the United States and its Pacific partners resolutely fought the Japanese soldiers and their sea infantry to a seeming standstill at Tulagi, Tanambogo, Gavutu and Guadalcanal Islands, before ultimately crushing the enemy that had not been defeated for 2,900 years. Japanese manpower statistics on the Guadalcanal campaign indicate 31,358 troops were involved. However, the totals presented in this work, compiled from captured records, show a very different level of commitment, even if one excludes the 4,657 Imperial Japanese Navy personnel that participated in the fighting. Either Imperial General Headquarters was downplaying the extent of its losses in dissembling about Japanese victories, or it maintained unreliable records. The IGHQ had claimed that 7,646 soldiers of the 38th Infantry Division were sent to Guadalcanal, yet the total complement of the division was 18,485, and 7 of the 11 transports carrying the division were sunk en route, with an estimated loss of 5,000 men. The IGHQ also recorded that 10,318 men of the 2nd Division were committed, but the divisional strength was 14,300 men, and the entire division is known to have fought on Guadalcanal. Why would the High Command have withheld 4,000 men when clearly all of them were needed for victory? Thousands of Japanese records were burned or destroyed in August 1945 to prevent their falling into Allied hands, but based on an examination of documents captured during and immediately after the war, I have estimated that about 40,000 Japanese participated in the Guadalcanal struggle. Apparently, Japan lost more men than she cared to admit. Of the total number of Japanese on the island, some 1,000 became prisoners of war, though most of those were non-combatant personnel from construction units. It is known that 10,660 Japanese, including 870 sailors, were evacuated from the island. These figures imply that approximately 39,000 were killed or died from disease. The totals do not include unknown numbers of sailors lost at sea or air crews on hundreds of shot-down aircraft. The U.S. Marine Corps Air Arm alone accounted for 427 Japanese planes. For the Americans, Guadalcanal was a hellhole. Many men were close to starvation, all lost body weight, and almost everyone had malaria or some sort of fever. Though even with a temperature of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, men were considered fit for ground combat or flying. Most had intestinal problems, the trots, at one time or another, and because there was no toilet tissue, incoming letters became a practical gift from home. Jungle rot was rampant. Many troops had worn-out, eaten-away shoes and no socks. The men slept on the ground, and they were always wet. Each new day brought another burst of rain or soaking drizzle, usually at unpredictable times. Every foxhole was a swamp, jungle hot, with suffocating temperatures and oppressive humidity. Under the most grueling conditions imaginable, these untested American boys stood to arms and ultimately won. For 6 agonizing months, the Americans on Guadalcanal fought the longest campaign of the Pacific War. None of the later conquests in the Pacific would have been possible without that hard-won victory. American losses were not insubstantial, but not as staggering as those sustained by the Japanese. A total of about 65,000 Americans had been committed, including those of the U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Army Ground Forces, and U.S. Navy construction units. The Marine Corps, which fielded 2 divisions, lost 1,094 killed in action, 103 dead from wounds, and 145 missing and presumed dead. The wounded totaled 3,170, and untold numbers were afflicted with malaria and tropical infections. The U.S. Navy reported 4,737 killed in action or missing at sea, and 2,344 wounded. The U.S. Army's Americal Division had 334 killed and 850 wounded. The 25th Infantry Division, which arrived late in the campaign, reported 216 killed and 439 wounded. The U.S. Navy lost 41 airmen killed and countless wounded. The Marine Corps Air Arm lost an undisclosed number. The USAAF's 13th Air Force reported 93 killed and an unknown number wounded. Many Americans were captured by the enemy and never heard of again. The Allies' First Pacific Offensive halted the Japanese advance and took away the enemy's initiative, but at war's end the Japanese would feel the cost of defeat much more than just in manpower. Japan's offensive capability had been permanently affected. Her ship losses had been heavy, and the deaths of hundreds of skilled and experienced pilots would cripple future operations. With the Japanese gone, Guadalcanal became a strategically situated advance base, boasting 6 airfields, which enabled the Allies to continue the push through the Solomon Islands toward Rabaul. Ultimately, Guadalcanal became the springboard for the Pacific battles to come, for in time, hundreds of thousands of troops either would be stationed there or pass through on their way to the Philippines, Okinawa, and, eventually, the doorstep of Tokyo. Published to all hands, X on August 7th. This force will recapture Tulagi and Guadalcanal Islands, which are now in the hands of the enemy. X in this forward step toward clearing the Japanese out of conquered territory. We have strong support from the Pacific Fleet and from the air, surface, and submarine forces in the South Pacific and Australian L. It is significant of victory that we see here, shoulder to shoulder, the US Navy Marines and the Army and the Australian and New Zealand Air Naval and Army Services. I have confidence that all elements of this armada will in skill and courage show themselves fit comrades of those brave men who already have dealt the enemy mighty blows for our great cause. God bless you all. XRK Turner, Rear Admiral US Navy Commanding, /S/HL Pitts, Commander US Navy, Executive Officer.